The rain had been falling since before dawn, a steady, cold curtain that blurred the edge of the narrow street. The sound was constant, but beneath it came something thin and urgent, a high-pitched cry, sharp enough to cut through the water's hiss. At first it rose and fell with the wind, almost easy to dismiss as some distant noise, but it persisted, fragile and uneven. When she stepped to the door and pulled it open, the air rushed in cold against her face. And there, on the worn stone step, was a puppy no bigger than her forearm, pressed low to the ground as if the weight of the rain alone could keep him down. His fur clung in dark clumps to his skin, every rib marked under the slick surface. His head was lifted just enough for his eyes to meet hers, but they held no urgency, only the dull, exhausted focus of an animal past the first fight for survival. Water dripped from his muzzle in a slow rhythm, pooling between his front paws. The tip of his tail lay still, flattened against the stone, unmoving even when she crouched closer. She stayed there for a moment, one hand braced against the door frame, the other lowered slowly until her fingers hovered just above the wet stone. The puppy did not back away, but his body tensed in a faint ripple along his shoulders. Every movement in the rain seemed harder for him. The way he blinked, the way his sides lifted and fell in shallow, measured breaths. The air smelled faintly of earth and wet metal. Somewhere behind her the kettle had gone quiet on the stove, but she didn't move from the step. The cries had stopped now, replaced by small huffs of air through his nose, each one cut short. He was thin in a way that looked recent. Not the steady leanness of a stray built for distance, but the sharper, uneven shape of sudden hunger. She eased down to her knees, letting the hem of her robe soak through on the wet step. "Hey," she said quietly, just enough for her voice to carry over the rain. The puppy's ears twitched once, not fully lifting. His gaze shifted to her hand, then back to her face. Still, he did not move. It was clear he had no shelter, no protection from the cold pressing into his small frame. If he stayed where he was, the combination of wet and chill could weaken him past recovery before the day was half over. She extended her hand, palm up, waiting. The rain ran over her fingers and down her wrist, dripping to the stone beside him. After a long pause, the puppy shifted his front paw forward an inch, then another. His head lowered, muzzle almost brushing her skin, but he stopped short, as if weighing what the movement might cost him. Up close, she could see the faint shiver running through his limbs, the way his claws clicked lightly against the stone when they moved. She knew that lifting him now would be the only way to give him a chance. But if he resisted, if he bolted into the rain in his current state, it might be the last time she saw him alive. His survival hinged on a decision he could not understand, but she could not delay. Carefully, she slid her other hand under his chest, the soaked fur slipping against her palm. He flinched, a small, sharp motion, but did not pull away. She lifted, feeling the lightness of him. Too light for his size, too light for the way his legs hung limp. The water from his fur ran down her forearms in thin lines as she rose. Behind her, the warm air from the open door drifted out into the rain. She stepped backward into it, carrying him across the threshold. His body remained still in her hands, head resting weakly against her wrist. Outside, the street was already beginning to blur in the growing rain, but inside, the first drops from his fur hit the wooden floor in a quiet, steady pattern. If he warmed up soon, he might live. If not, the cold had already done its work. She closed the door against the rain, the latch clicking softly in the dim light. The puppy hung in her arms without resistance, his small weight barely pressing against her chest. Water ran steadily from his fur, soaking through the sleeve of her robe, seeping cold into her skin. She crossed the narrow kitchen and pulled a folded towel from the back of a chair, wrapping it around him with slow, careful movements so as not to startle him. The fabric darkened almost immediately, the dampness spreading in uneven patches as she tucked the edges around his thin body. Near the stove, the air was warmer, the faint heat from the low flame carrying into the room. She lowered him onto an old blanket she kept by the wall, arranging him so his head rested slightly above his paws. His eyes were half-lidded, the dullness in them making it difficult to tell if he was looking at her at all. His breathing stayed shallow, the rise and fall of his chest so light it barely shifted the towel. She moved to the counter and filled a small bowl with fresh water, placing it just within reach of his nose. The steam from the stove carried the faint scent of damp wood, but there was no shift in his body, no sign that he noticed the bowl at all. Droplets still clung to his whiskers, but his tongue did not move toward them. Hunger could wait, but without water soon, his body would not recover from the cold. Kneeling again, she slid her hand under the towel to feel the thin ribs along his side. The skin beneath was cool, not with the steady chill of a winter night, but the deeper cold that seemed to come from inside. She spoke softly, her voice barely above the crackle of the stove. "It's all right. You're safe now." His ear twitched faintly, though it could have been from the shift in air when she adjusted the towel. For a moment she tried holding the bowl closer, tilting it so the surface of the water almost touched his nose. Still, there was no movement. The limpness in his legs and the slack weight of his head warned her how close he was to shutting down completely. If the warmth did not reach him soon, and if he could not swallow water within the next hour, there was little she could do to change what the night would bring. She fetched another towel, drier and thicker, and pressed it gently along his sides, drawing the moisture away from his fur. Each pass brought up the scent of rain and the faint, sharp odor of neglect, the smell of a dog that had gone too long without shelter. He stayed still through it, eyes closing now and then, opening again only part way. By the time she finished, the towel beneath him was damp and warm from the stove's heat. She adjusted the blanket, folding one edge over his hips. Outside, the rain still struck the roof in a constant rhythm, the sound unbroken except for a distant car passing along the wet road. Inside, the air was still, every movement small and measured so as not to break whatever fragile calm he had found. She sat beside him on the floor, leaning against the wall, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the blanket. His breathing was steady enough to count now, but slower than it should have been. She watched the shallow rise and fall, the towel rising with it, thinking of the simple truth. If he could take even a few sips soon, he might live. If not, the night would be too long for him to survive. She found the smallest dish she owned, a shallow piece of worn ceramic from the back of the cupboard, and filled it with fresh water. The surface trembled slightly as she carried it back to the blanket, the heat from the stove warming the air around them. The puppy lay just as she had left him, wrapped in the towel, eyes half closed. His ears gave no sign he had heard her approach. Kneeling close, she slid one hand beneath his chin, her fingers brushing against the damp fur at his jaw. The skin there was cooler than she wanted, but not as cold as before. She brought the dish near enough that the faint reflection of his nose broke the surface. At first there was no reaction, only the soft sound of his breathing. Then his nostrils twitched once, and his head shifted by the smallest angle toward the dish. She waited, holding her position until his tongue flicked out, touching the water just enough to send a ripple across the surface. He paused, then licked again, more slowly this time, the movement deliberate but weak. The sound was soft, barely louder than the faint tick of the stove. She kept the dish steady, feeling the light pressure of his chin against her fingers. Each swallow seemed to loosen the tension in his neck. His eyes opened a fraction wider, though they remained clouded with exhaustion. The towel around his shoulders darkened again where water dripped from his muzzle, but she let him continue, counting each slow movement. She could feel the rise and fall of his breath against her palm. Still shallow, but less strained now. When he stopped, she lowered the dish to the floor, giving him space. He kept his head lifted for a moment longer before letting it rest back against the folded towel. The small effort had left him still again. But there was a subtle difference in the way his body lay now. Less rigid, more settled into the warmth beneath him. She sat back slightly, watching his chest. The breaths came a little deeper now, though she counted each one as she had before, making sure there was no hitch or uneven pause. Outside, the rain was easing, the steady patter breaking into softer, irregular drops that tapped against the window. The air inside held the faint, clean scent of water over warm wood. From time to time his ears twitched, as if faint sounds were reaching him again. Once his tail moved, not lifting, only a slight shift under the blanket, but enough for her to see he still had some strength to spare. The small change was worth noting. If he could keep water down and rest without losing warmth, his chances would grow with each passing hour. She leaned forward once more, letting her hand rest gently over the edge of the towel, close enough to feel the heat collecting under it. The fabric was warm now, a sign the stove's steady work was reaching him. He did not move away from her touch, and that too was something. For the first time since finding him on the step, she allowed herself to draw a full breath. The risk was still sharp and immediate. His strength could fail again before night. But the first drop had been taken, and with it came the smallest shift in the balance between holding on and letting go. The towel had done its work, but his fur still held the damp heaviness of the rain. She brought another cloth from the kitchen, softer and thicker, and began pressing it gently along his back. Each pass drew out more water, leaving the fur fluffed unevenly in pale and dark patches. He lay still beneath her touch, his body yielding only enough to shift with her movements. As she worked along his neck, her fingers caught on something rough beneath the fur. She eased the cloth aside and found a thin length of frayed rope, knotted loosely but worn deep into the coat. The fibers were stiff with age and weather, strands splitting where they had rubbed against skin for too long. She lifted it carefully, the weightless loop resting against her palm, and saw the raw skin beneath. A narrow ring where fur had thinned, and the flesh was rubbed red. The sight settled in her chest like a stone. This was no mark from a few hours in the rain. It was the kind that came from days, maybe weeks, of pressure and friction. The kind that didn't happen to a dog free to roam. If the rope had been tighter, the skin might have broken through. If it had been left longer, it could have closed his windpipe. She rose without a word and fetched a small pair of scissors from a drawer. Kneeling again, she rested her hand against the blanket near his front paw, letting him see the slow movement before she touched the rope. His eyes opened at the shift, dull brown meeting hers for a brief moment before sliding away. The first cut was quiet, the blades closing through the stiff fibers without pulling. She worked one section at a time, turning the loop gently so it wouldn't catch against the tender skin. When the last strand parted, she drew the rope away in a single motion, placing it on the floor beside her. It lay there, curled and broken, the frayed ends splayed out like a thing no longer holding purpose. She touched the raw mark lightly with her fingertips, feeling the faint warmth of irritation under the skin. "No more," she murmured, the words barely more than breath. He blinked once, slow and deliberate, his head lowering until it touched the blanket again. The rest of his body stayed curled, paws tucked close to his chest, shoulders tight as if holding onto a shell he had built for himself. She went back to the cloth, pressing gently along his sides, working in small circles to keep the heat building in his fur. Each movement was deliberate, meant to comfort without asking for a response. He gave no sign of resistance, but neither did he lean into her touch. The stillness was its own kind of guard, one he would have to lower on his own time. The rope sat where she had left it, darkened from the damp and frayed in places where his struggles had worn it thin. She glanced at it once before turning her focus back to him. The mark at his neck would take time to heal, but at least the pressure was gone now. Without it, the next breaths would come easier, and if he chose to rest here a little longer, the warmth might start to do what it was meant to, carry him past the things that had held him down before she opened the door. By the time the first light reached the edges of the curtains, the air in the kitchen had shifted from the damp chill of the night to a steady, dry warmth. The stove still held a faint glow from the low flame she had kept burning. The puppy was where she had left him. Curled on the blanket, the towel slipped partly away during the night. His breathing was even now, slow but deeper than it had been when she first carried him in from the rain. When she stepped into the room, his ears moved first, a small flicker at the sound of her footfall. His head lifted a moment later, the motion deliberate, as though the muscles had to think before obeying. The eyes that found her were clearer than the night before, still ringed with weariness but following her as she crossed the kitchen. She set a shallow dish of water near the edge of the blanket and moved to the counter for the kettle. When she turned back, his gaze was still fixed on her. She knelt beside him, resting her hand lightly on the folded towel. His body tensed at the touch, then eased. Without prompting, he shifted forward, placing one paw ahead of the other. The movement was awkward. His front leg wavered under the effort, and his hindquarters lagged as if unsure of their role. But the intention was clear. Another step followed, unsteady but without collapse, and he closed the small space between them. The sound of his claws against the floor was faint, almost lost beneath the soft ticking of the stove. She let her hand drift to the space in front of him, and his nose brushed against her fingers in a brief, uncertain touch before he lowered himself back onto the blanket. The effort left him still again. But there was a subtle change in the way he lay. Less guarded, his paws stretched out instead of folded tightly under his chest. She offered the dish once more, and this time he leaned toward it without her guiding hand. The first few laps were slow, his tongue breaking the surface in small ripples, but soon he found a rhythm, pausing only to lift his head and glance at her before continuing. Each swallow was a step toward rebuilding what the rain and neglect had stripped from him. When he finished, he stayed close, his chest rising and falling with the steady pulse of a body beginning to recover. She adjusted the blanket so it covered more of his back, feeling the warmth that had built in his fur overnight. His eyes closed after a moment, but the flicker of movement in his ears told her he was aware of her still sitting nearby. It was not yet certain how far his strength would return. A few steps were only the beginning, and the weakness in his gait showed how fragile his progress remained. But if he could walk, even slowly, there was a chance, and for now that chance was enough to carry them both into the hours ahead. The rain had stopped sometime before midday, leaving the yard soft underfoot and carrying the smell of wet soil through the air. She had opened the kitchen window to let the dampness lift, the sound of sparrows in the hedges replacing the steady hiss of water that had filled the past day. The puppy was dozing in a patch of pale light on the floor, his breathing slow and steady, when a sharp rattle came from the front gate. Through the narrow gap between curtain and wall, she saw the shape of her neighbor standing outside, one hand on the latch. He was an older man, the kind who noticed things without trying, his boots dark from the walk up the road. She stepped out into the yard, pulling the robe tighter around her as she reached the gate. "Found him at my door yesterday morning," she said, after the man's eyes drifted toward the open kitchen door where the puppy lay just in view. The neighbor's brow furrowed, his gaze holding for a long moment before he shook his head. "I've seen one like that before," he said, voice low but certain. "There's a man coming through on the road east, leaving them on the verge or worse. Don't look back once he's done." His hand tightened on the gatepost, the wood creaking faintly under the grip. If it's the same pup, he was meant to be gone by now. The words sat heavy between them, carried as much by the way he spoke as by their meaning. She glanced back at the small figure on the blanket, the towel now folded neatly beside him. His head had lifted, ears tilting toward the sound of voices, eyes tracking in their direction. She asked a few questions, trying to place the time and place her neighbor had seen the man, but there was little to connect beyond the description. A thin, young dog with markings like this one, alone by the roadside in the rain. The neighbor didn't stay long. Before leaving, he looked once more toward the kitchen and gave a brief nod, something between acknowledgement and quiet approval. When she returned inside, the puppy was still watching the doorway. She crossed the room slowly, letting the floorboards carry the sound of her steps. His gaze followed her until she knelt beside him. She poured fresh water into his dish, and he drank without hesitation this time, pausing only to lift his head and listen toward the yard as if the visitor's presence still lingered in the air. The thought settled in her mind with a steady weight. If what the neighbor said was true, the night she found him had not been an accident. Whatever road had brought him here had been chosen for him, and not in kindness. If that was the case, then every step he took now was against an ending someone else had decided. And as long as he could keep taking them, the outcome might yet be different. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared enough for a walk into town. The air was still cool from the rain, the ground holding the scent of wet leaves and earth. She left the puppy resting on the blanket, the stove banked low to keep the room warm, and returned an hour later with a small paper bag in her hands. The sound of the door opening brought his head up, ears pricking faintly as she set the bag on the table. Inside was a narrow collar, soft leather dyed a deep brown, the kind made for comfort more than show. She sat on the floor beside him, turning it in her hands once before resting it near the edge of the blanket. He sniffed at it briefly, his nose brushing the smooth surface, then looked back at her without shifting away. She worked slowly, loosening the buckle so the loop would slide easily over his head. Her fingers moved through the fur at his neck, parting it gently around the healing mark where the rope had been. The skin was still pink, but no longer raw. She slipped the collar over his ears, easing it down until it lay against the base of his neck. It sat lightly, not pressing, the leather soft against the fur. For a moment she kept her hands there, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath. He stayed still, eyes calm, body uncurled from the tight posture he'd held on the first day. There was no flinch, no hesitation. If anything, the stillness carried a quiet acceptance, as though this new weight was nothing to guard against. "You're staying," she said softly, the words low enough that they barely reached past them. It was not a decision made in that moment. She had known it since the night he took the first drop of water, but speaking it gave it shape, turned it from care into commitment. She adjusted the blanket around him, and he lowered his head again, the collar resting against his fur as if it had always been there. Outside, the late light slanted across the yard, catching on the damp edges of the grass. She stayed beside him until his breathing settled back into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. It was no longer a matter of whether he would leave once he was strong enough. The choice was made, final and unshifting. Whatever road had brought him to her door, it ended here, not as a rescue, not as a temporary shelter, but as a home. And in the quiet warmth of the kitchen, with the faint glow of the stove and the sound of his steady breathing, that truth felt certain enough to hold. The sun was lowering when she opened the door. The light stretched thin across the street, turning the wet road into a muted mirror of gold and gray. The air carried the smell of damp stone and the faint sweetness of leaves still drying from yesterday's rain. The puppy stood just inside the threshold, ears lifted, his new collar catching the last of the light. When she stepped forward, he followed without pause, his paws making soft, steady taps against the worn boards of the porch before dropping into the cool, puddled road. They moved at an easy pace, her stride short enough for him to keep close at her side. His tail lifted with each step, not high and rigid, but in a loose curve that swayed with the rhythm of his movement. There was no rush in him, no hesitation, just the quiet intention of staying near. Every so often he glanced up toward her, his gaze alert but soft, as though quietly checking the distance between them before returning his focus to the path. The road still held pockets of water in its low places, each one catching the fading light until the ripple of his paws broke them into slow-moving rings. The sound was light, barely more than a whisper over the soft grit of gravel and the faint brushing of his nails. He slowed now and then to lower his nose to the ground, following a scent only he could read, before stepping back into place beside her without being called. There was no trace now of the frayed rope that had once marked his neck. only the smooth, warm leather resting gently against his fur. As they passed along the row of houses, she let her eyes shift toward the spot in the distance where she had found him. The step, where he had lain in the rain, was out of sight now, hidden behind a slow bend in the lane. It was strange how quickly a place could shift in meaning. What had been a scene of desperation just days ago was now simply part of the street, washed clean by the passing weather. For him, the distance was measured not in streets or minutes, but in the steady rhythm of pause that carried him forward without faltering. They reached a stretch where the hedges on either side leaned over the road, their leaves heavy with droplets that fell when the breeze stirred them. The puppy's ears flicked at each soft patter, but his pace didn't change. When they passed under a low branch, he shook himself once, a quick, efficient motion that sent a fine spray into the evening light. It caught in the air for a moment before falling to the road behind them, gone as quickly as it had come. Near the bend, the light deepened into amber, softening the edges of the houses and throwing their shadows long across the ground. She slowed, letting him wander a step or two ahead. He moved toward the verge, his paws pressing into the damp grass, nose working in small, deliberate arcs. The smell of wet soil lifted into the air, mingling with the cool scent of the evening. When she moved forward again, he trotted back to her side without prompting, the quiet tap of his paws falling into rhythm with hers. The gate came into view just as the last of the sun slipped low behind the trees. Its wood was still dark from the rain, the iron latch streaked with thin lines of moisture. She opened it with one hand, holding it just wide enough for them both to pass through. Inside the yard, the ground was softer, the grass cool underfoot, carrying the faint sound of water shifting somewhere deep in the soil. The puppy's steps were lighter here, the ground giving under his weight in a way that made his tail lift higher for a few paces before settling again. She closed the gate behind them, the click of the latch quiet in the stillness. They crossed the yard together, his path bending once toward a patch of grass before he came back in line beside her. By the time they reached the door, the light had thinned to a soft gray, and the shapes of the hedges along the fence had begun to blur into shadow. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the kitchen wrapped around them, carrying the faint smell of the stove's low flame. She unfastened the latch on his collar just enough to loosen it, letting it rest easy around his neck as he settled back onto the blanket. His breathing slowed almost at once, his eyes following her as she crossed the room. She stood there for a moment, listening, not just to the quiet in the kitchen, but to the memory of the sound they had made together on the road, the soft, steady rhythm of paws against wet stone, carrying him away from the place where he had once cried alone in the rain. It was a sound she knew would remain with her long after the last puddles dried, a reminder of the road between where he began and where he had come to stay.